I believe it was Tom Brokaw. He wrote a book in 1998, and if you kept up with him, or you may have seen it in other documentaries, the phrase the greatest generation. Y'all have heard that, right? The greatest generation. You know what the greatest generation was? It was that generation that was born between 1901 to 1927. It was the generation of my grandparents. They would come to age during the Great Depression. The Great Depression formed their outlook on life in very unique ways. If you know someone that grew up during the Great Depression, you will know that they had some ways that today that a lot of people would laugh at. They were very thrifty. They would save everything. They were people that did not throw things away because they went without. Things were hard. It was also the generation, and this is probably the second major factor in the greatest generation, was that they served in World War II, which was one of the largest worldwide outbreaks of war, the most casualties of any kind of war. It led World War II, the results of it led to so many implications that we're still seeing today. In fact, what we're seeing in Ukraine is an implication from World War II. You may not know that. You may not think of that initially as an implication, but it is. Because Russia is trying to reclaim something that they had as a result of World War II. Ukraine. They want it back. And so this is just an example of how this greatest generation lived through a major turmoil. Their children were the baby boomers. And if you're sitting there and you're a baby boomer, please don't get mad at me for saying this. But that generation was not the greatest generation. That generation saw some of the biggest flourishing and economic growth in our history. And don't get mad at me, but they're spoiled. They did not suffer. They did not suffer like their fathers did, like their mothers did. That's exactly what the book of Joshua and how it ends. Open your Bibles to the book of Joshua, chapter 24. The writer of Joshua, whoever he is, makes that very point that the generation that Joshua had the privilege to lead because of his calling of God knew and served the Lord. And I'm praying on whether to go into the book of Judges. I might in a few weeks. I might in a few months. I don't know. I'm waiting on God to speak to my heart on what to do there. I might go, it might be a couple years from now. I don't know. But if you know much about the book of Judges, you know that it's a continuation of the story. The story of Joshua ends tonight. His story ends. It's stated here that the generation that Joshua was privileged to lead knew and served the Lord, but you'll know that the next generation didn't. They knew something about God. There's a lot of convicting things here in these last few verses. I love the way this book ends because it gives us some closure to the person of Joshua, but at the same time, it's not just about Joshua. What is really emphasized here is the faithfulness of God. And so we're going to look at three different burials, three different men that are noted at the end of this book. It's Joshua, and believe it or not, it's Joseph. Joseph has not been in the story in the book of Joshua. And then Eleazar. You know Eleazar, he is in the story of Joshua, in the book. But first of all, I want you to notice this in the first few verses is this courageous servant of the Lord. The courageous servant of the Lord. Why do I say that? Well, the text in verse 29 through 31, it talks about he is a servant. Where do you get courageous? Well, I get that from chapter 1. And he would never be able to, listen to me very carefully, this is key, because a lot of people have things backwards. You cannot serve unless you know God. You cannot serve God unless you know Him. Joshua knew the Lord. And his greatest accomplishment is that he listened to God. In chapter 1, it is God directly speaking to Joshua. And he's saying, do you remember what he said? Remember what he said in chapter 1? What's Joshua 1:9 say? Doesn't it say something like, don't y'all have it on your refrigerator? Some of you are nodding your head. I see some of you saying it. A cross stitch on your wall or something. It says, be strong and be very courageous. That's not what the writer of Joshua said. That's what God said to Joshua. And so Joshua listened to what God said. He knew God. He knew God in a very intimate way, and he listened to God. And then he served God. Notice what it says here in verse 29 of our text. That's what's highlighted. And it came to pass after these things. Let me stop right here. What are these things? It's his entire life. It is specifically probably looking back to the covenant renewal that took place at Shechem, but it's probably after the conquest of the land. It is his leadership skills of bringing the nation across the Jordan and occupying the land and taking the inheritance that God gave him. You don't know what leadership looks like? It looks like a man following God and leading people to God. That's what Joshua did. And it came to pass after these things. It's kind of funny when you read that. It's like it almost seems to diminish the accomplishments of Joshua. And you know what I'm going to say about that? That's okay. Because Joshua would be the first one to tell you, I couldn't have done anything without the Lord. I couldn't have done any of this. I did this not based upon my own strength, on my own ingenuity. How many times do you think that Joshua was probably faced with a dilemma and faced with a problem, faced with a crossroads, and he probably said, I do not know what to do. I'm going to ask God what to do. Undoubtedly, many times he did that. Came to pass after these things that Joshua, the son of Nun, that's the way he's always referred to in the book of Joshua. And then this little phrase, the servant of the Lord, is attached to his name. What an honor. And by the way, that is the highest title that anyone could ever wear. And did you know it's only said of Joshua in this one time in his whole life? It's never said of Joshua while he was alive that he was the servant of the Lord. Isn't that interesting? A lot of people today they claim such a big spot, a big exalted place in the Lord's work, doing things in the guise of the Lord's work. Joshua did all these things, and God never called him the servant of the Lord until he was dead. The only other person that it said the servant of the Lord is Moses. And that was stated about Moses 14 times. Go back to Joshua 1:1 and you'll find that Joshua is called the assistant to Moses. And Moses was the servant of the Lord. Moses was a servant of the Lord, and I'm going to tell you what Moses can be viewed as, and also Jesus is called the servant of the Lord as well. If you look into Isaiah, you'll see the suffering servant, and it is used of the Messiah, which is Jesus, and it's also used of Israel. It's used of Moses, and when Joshua is dead, it is used about him. Let me tell you the big idea about the servant of the Lord. It's deliverer. He is a deliverer of people. Moses was a deliverer of God's people out of Egypt. Jesus is a deliverer of His people from sin. It was only said of Joshua after he died. So that's interesting, isn't it? Notice here it says, the servant of the Lord, he died. And he was 110 years old. And they buried him in the border of his inheritance in Timnath-Serah, which is in Mount Ephraim, on the north side of the hill of Gaash. And here's where I want you to pay attention very closely in verse 31. This is a theological minefield right here. This is nothing bad. It's just packed full of theology. Notice in verse 31, and Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua and which had known all the works of the Lord that He had done for Israel. I've already alluded to it, but let me just reinforce it and bring it to a close. There's two key words in verse 31. They are known and served. You must know the Lord, and then you will serve Him. How did they know Him? They knew God because of all the miracles that they saw as they took the land. They listened to God. They were faithful to God. I don't know about you, maybe it's just my own background, but as I was reading, and I'm not even saying this is the intent of the book of Joshua, but as I was reading through Joshua and studying Joshua, I always felt like right around the corner, something bad was going to happen because it was going too good. And there was a couple of moments with Achan's sin that things went haywire. You remember that? But this was, like I said a while ago, the greatest generation. If there was a generation in Israel's history that you would say, you know what? They were close to God. They served God. This was the generation. Let me tell you what else they knew about God, is they knew God did not allow sin, would not accept their sin. I don't know where people have gotten the heretical theology, but it's prevalent, that sin is okay, that sin is acceptable. I'm finding more and more, and I was thinking about this earlier today, and I thought about, I wonder how it will be when Bentley is older. I wonder what the standards will be like among God's people. Will they be putting these things on Facebook, and will they be teaching it in Sunday school class of how, I lived this life, but God still loves me. But God doesn't, He's not accepting your lifestyle. Like their lifestyle is excusable. And I'm not just talking about some type of alternate lifestyle. I'm talking about a lifestyle that ignores the commands of God, like gossiping, like lying, like not thinking that living a separated life from the world is okay, like just not loving like you should, that kind of lifestyle. I'm not talking about anything bizarre that you'll find in San Francisco or Chicago. I'm talking about every day just not holding to Christian values, biblical values that are in the Bible. It's not okay. It's not okay to be sinful and wicked. It's not. But people are constantly putting their own little twist and spin on living the Christian life and then taking grace and justifying the way they live. We don't have a cheap grace. What is the value of the blood of Jesus? It doesn't mean a thing to some people who devalue the grace of God. Let me tell you what this generation knew. They knew that God did not put up with sin because their parents and their grandparents were killed one by one in the wilderness. That's this generation. I mentioned the Great Depression era and the Great Depression generation, the World War II generation a while ago, and for Americans and for patriotism, that's the greatest generation of America. This generation in Israel's history was the greatest generation, and what they endured was the judgment of God at the rebellion at Kadesh Barnea, when they said no to God. And God said, okay, and one by one I'm going to kill all of you until I've made the nation like I want it, and then I'll take those kids into the land. So they knew and they served the Lord all the days of Joshua. What a compliment, right? While Joshua was the leader, he led them to God. And then it says there that also the elders that outlived Joshua, the elders that were influenced by Joshua, the nation served the Lord. Joshua had an immediate impact on his contemporaries, and then he also left a legacy behind him. I want to tell you, that is what you want to hear at your funeral, is that he will be remembered because he took people to God, and the people that he led continued on serving after he was gone. After I'm no longer pastor at New Haven Missionary Baptist Church, I hope this church flourishes. I hope that it goes on to bigger and better things. I hope that it will not depend on the man. I'm going to tell you, there's been some fatal just mistakes, tragedies in churches when people become in love with the man instead of in love with Jesus. I always want to be the one that points you to Jesus. Love God with all your heart and serve Jesus. Know who He is and know what it means to serve Him. Let's go to the next one. Look at this second one here. It's the vindication of believing God. You know what it's like to be doubted, to be scoffed at. You know what it's like to try to take a stand for God and people to doubt that your God really cares about you. His name is Joseph. And I guarantee you, when he was being scoffed at and mocked by his brothers and thrown in a pit, he probably never thought that he would be buried in a land that God had promised. When he started having those dreams, I think things probably changed, though. He had some dreams before he was thrown in the pit, but after he got down into Egypt and he was working for a guy named Potiphar, he began having dreams and God began speaking to his heart. And he grew very close to God. It said the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was watching out for Joseph. If you look at the very end of the book of Genesis, he said to his sons, God is going to come back and He's going to rescue this people. And He's going to deliver you out of this land. And you're going to carry my bones up out of here. Did Joseph, when he was in that pit, where do you think that he was going to be buried? Probably thought he'd end up being buried who knows where. But he wasn't buried in Egypt. He was buried in his own land. His brothers betrayed him and sold him out of the land, but eventually his bones ended up in the land. Well, God used him in a amazing way to also be a deliverer of his family, a deliverer of his people. You remember the story, right? The famine, they're starving. But God had him there for a purpose. And Jacob and all the boys would end up moving down there. And by the way, Jacob wasn't buried in Egypt either. Jacob was buried in the land of Canaan. They went back for a funeral there in chapter 50. What's interesting is the boys who sold their brother to a different land, they were buried in Egypt, as far as we can tell. It doesn't say anything about their bones coming out of Egypt. It's interesting on that reversal, isn't it? And Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and the bones of Joseph, verse 32, and the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up out of Egypt, buried they in Shechem, in a parcel of ground which Jacob bought of the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver, and it became the inheritance of the children of Joseph. A couple of things here. First of all, when the children of Israel were marching out of Egypt, I guarantee you people were scoffing. They didn't think that, well, where are they going? What do they got? They're going to go out and die in the wilderness. This is not going to work. And the Egyptians were thinking, oh, they'll come back. They can't make it out there alone. But they believed God and they took those bones with them. The second thing is this. Did you notice where he's buried? He's buried in it says, a parcel of ground that was purchased by his father. You see that? His father, Jacob, bought this piece of ground a long time ago, and it was a burial plot. And that's where his bones were put. But then, this parcel, it no longer has to be purchased, does it? Because God gave them the land. Formerly, it had to be bought, but now it is given. It is given by God. God gave them that ground. And so you see the amazing thing here is the second example of God's faithfulness. You see there in verse 31 when it said Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua. That's a direct fulfillment of God speaking to Joshua and saying, no one is going to be able to stand up to you. Be strong and very courageous. You're going to lead this people into the land. And he did. God is faithful. Number two, when it says the bones of Joseph came up out of Egypt, that's also an example of God is faithful. Number three, notice this, is the faithfulness and consistency of an obscure priest. We probably are not well versed in Eliezer, are we? Until we look at the book of Joshua. And then we see how important he was. He's a minor character in the Bible, but he played a major role as standing next to Joshua. By the way, was Joshua a king? No, he wasn't a king. He was just a leader that God raised up, and God selected Joshua to lead his people. But the priesthood is a little bit different. Eliezer saw some things, and Eliezer also left a legacy. Eliezer saw his dad Aaron die in the wilderness, but he also saw his uncle Moses, and he saw both of them serving God. He watched them, and he learned a lot from how God dealt with Moses and how God dealt with Aaron. And then also Eliezer had a son named Phinehas. And by the way, look at verse 33, and both are mentioned. And Eliezer, the son of Aaron, died. You see there his dad is mentioned in this verse. And they buried him in a hill that pertaineth to Phinehas, his son, which was given him in Mount Ephraim. What jumps out to us is the lineage there, doesn't it? His dad and his son. Right there in the middle, Eliezer. And we remember from the previous chapters when they were distributing the land, it turned into a very formal ceremony where Joshua and Eleazar side by side were distributing the land to the different tribes, and that was their service. I want to leave you with this: is that Eleazar and Phinehas, they came out of the wilderness. They were in the wilderness. Their dad did not come out of the wilderness. Moses did not come out of the wilderness. Joshua and Caleb came out of the wilderness. Eleazar came out of the wilderness. They survived it. And Phinehas was also very active in the wilderness. You remember I referred to that. I believe it's in Numbers 25, where Phinehas throws a javelin through a Israelite who is having an inappropriate relationship with a foreign woman there. And Phinehas was no doubt influenced by his godly father. He was faithful. Eleazar would not have been brought from the wilderness unless God had allowed him to because of his faithfulness. Let me leave you with this. I love the way this, here we are, look at it. You believe it? That's the end. That's the end of this book. I love the way the book ends. It ends with a celebration of the lives of these people. You know, we go to funerals, and I want you to hear me out. I don't want to be misunderstood. Now, I'm going to be just real transparent with you. We hear this phrase, a celebration of the life of someone. And I'll be honest with you. It's a lot easier for a friend to say that about the one who is deceased than it is the close family. For the close family, it's not much of a party. It's sad. It's a time of grieving. It's painful. But this is about as close as you can get to saying, wow, they are being celebrated here. They are, aren't they? They're being celebrated in their death. And I know when we say celebration of a life, it is, we remember all of the good things, and then we also know that they are heaven-bound and they're in a better place and all of these things. But it's still the human side of it. It is, death is painful. But here is what these three men would say if they could stand before you now. God is faithful. Serve Him God's way. I want to say that one more time. Everything I said is so important. God is faithful. Serve Him God's way. Our Father in heaven, we thank you so much for your word. We ask you...